She was still breathing when they left her there. The English had been clear about the terms. Charles VII understood what they wanted. He had signed other agreements before. This one required only his silence. Joan of Arc had carried him to Reims. She had stood beside him when the holy oil touched his forehead. The kingdom she helped him claim now belonged to him completely. What he chose not to do for her would be remembered longer than most of what he did. The capture happened at Compiègne in May 1430. Joan had ridden out to defend a town that wanted to resist Burgundian control. Charles had not ordered her to go. He had not forbidden it either. She was operating in that space where royal authority becomes deliberately vague. The Burgundians who surrounded her that day were not technically his enemies anymore. Treaties had been signed. Allegiances had shifted. The war had entered a phase where yesterday's allies became today's inconveniences. Joan did not fit neatly into the new arrangement. The Burgundians sold her to the English for 10,000 livres tournois. This was not a secret transaction. Everyone involved understood what the payment meant. The English wanted a trial. They wanted her condemned by the church. They wanted the coronation at Reims reframed as a ceremony blessed by a heretic and a witch. Charles knew this. His court knew this. The price had been negotiated openly. No one moved to counter the offer. French kings had ransomed their knights before. The practice was common enough to have established rates. A noble captured in battle could expect his family or his king to negotiate terms. Joan had no noble family. She had only the king she had crowned. Charles had gold. He had territories he could have offered in exchange. He had diplomatic channels that had worked for lesser captives. He used none of them. His silence was a choice, not an absence of options. The University of Paris sent representatives to the English. They wanted custody of Joan for trial. They framed their request in religious language. But the politics were transparent. The university had supported Burgundy throughout the Civil War. Its scholars had argued for years that Charles was illegitimate. Joan's conviction would confirm their position retroactively. The English agreed to the arrangement. They would supervise. The French clergy would provide the theological justification. Charles still said nothing. Joan spent months in English custody before the trial began. She was held in a military prison. Chained. Guarded by men who were not monks. Canon law required that a woman accused of religious crimes be held in a church prison under female supervision. The requirement was ignored. The Bishop of Beauvais, Pierre Cauchon, presided over the trial. He had fled from territories that recognized Charles. His income depended on English-controlled lands. His motivations were not hidden. Still, he was a bishop. The trial would be recorded as a church proceeding, not a military execution disguised as one. The questions they asked her were designed to trap her in contradictions. They asked about her voices. They asked if she knew whether she was in God's grace. The question was theologically impossible. Catholic doctrine held that no one could know their own state of grace with certainty. To say yes was to claim special knowledge that bordered on heresy. To say no was to admit doubt about everything she had done. Joan answered that if she was not in grace, she prayed God would place her there. And if she was, she prayed God would keep her there. Her response was theologically brilliant. It did not save her. They returned to her clothing repeatedly. She wore men's garments. She had worn them in battle. She continued to wear them in prison. They demanded she explain why. Joan told them she wore what protected her. She was surrounded by soldiers. The clothing was a barrier, however inadequate. They called it a renunciation of her sex and a defiance of divine order. They added it to the list of charges. The list was growing longer. The conclusion was predetermined. Charles could have sent lawyers. He could have sent theologians loyal to his cause. He could have publicly challenged the trial's legitimacy. The English were holding a French prisoner on French soil claimed by the French crown. Any assertion of royal authority would have forced a confrontation about jurisdiction. Charles made no assertion. His representatives never appeared in Rouen. His silence allowed the trial to proceed as if it had legitimacy. Joan recanted briefly under threat of immediate execution. They promised her a church prison. They promised female guards. They brought her back to the same cell with the same chains and the same soldiers. When she resumed wearing men's clothing, they called it a relapse into heresy. The reason she gave was the same as before. The clothes were protection. They recorded her words carefully. They used them as proof of her stubbornness and her refusal to submit. The trial concluded exactly as it had been designed to conclude. She was 19 years old when they burned her. The execution took place in the Rouen marketplace on May 30th, 1431. English soldiers surrounded the platform. Thousands watched. The fire was built high enough that the smoke would suffocate her before the flames consumed her entirely. It was meant to be a mercy. The executioner later said he could not arrange the wood correctly because of the height of the platform. She burned slowly. Some witnesses said she called out for Jesus. Others said she called for water. The English scattered her ashes in the Seine so no relics could be gathered. Charles did not attend. He did not send observers. He did not issue a statement. Joan had been convicted of heresy by a church court. To defend her now would be to question the church's judgment. He had worked carefully to rebuild his relationship with the Pope. He had needed that relationship to legitimize his coronation retroactively. Defending Joan would jeopardize the very legitimacy she had helped him claim. The logic was clear enough. It did not make the abandonment accidental. The war continued for another 22 years. Charles eventually retook Normandy. He retook Rouen, the city where Joan had burned. He did not revisit her trial immediately. He waited. In 1456, 25 years after her death, he authorized a papal commission to review the original proceedings. The timing was careful. Most of the original judges were dead. Pierre Cauchon was dead. The English had been expelled from all but Calais. The political risks of rehabilitating Joan had diminished significantly. The commission heard testimony from witnesses who had been excluded from the original trial. They heard from Jean Massou, the bailiff who had escorted Joan to the courtroom each day. They heard from Martin Ladvenu, the monk who had stayed with her until the end. They heard from her childhood friends, who testified about her piety and her kindness. The testimonies were recorded meticulously. The commission concluded that the original trial had been corrupt, politically motivated, and conducted in violation of canon law. Joan was declared innocent. Her conviction was annulled. Her reputation was restored officially. Charles never explained why he waited so long. He never addressed his silence during her captivity. The rehabilitation focused narrowly on the trial's procedural failures. It did not interrogate why the trial had been allowed to proceed unopposed. Joan's innocence was recognized. Charles's responsibility was left unexamined. The Church corrected its error carefully. The king's role in enabling that error remained outside the scope of the investigation. Later generations turned her into a symbol. French nationalists claimed her as the embodiment of resistance against foreign occupation. The Church canonized her in 1920, nearly 500 years after her death. She became Saint Joan, a martyr whose faith transcended political manipulation. The story became simpler in each retelling. She was the brave peasant girl who saved France and was betrayed by her enemies. The version left out the king who chose not to intervene. It left out the calculation behind his silence. It left out the years between her death and his decision to restore her name. What remains harder to simplify is the question of whether Charles believed she was genuine. He had accepted her help when he needed it. He had allowed her to fight beside his armies. He had stood beside her in Reims when the archbishop anointed him. If he believed she was a fraud, he had used her cynically and discarded her when she became inconvenient. If he believed she was divinely inspired, he had abandoned someone chosen by God to protect his political position. Either answer makes the silence worse. Joan had asked him for help. Witnesses testified that she sent letters from her cell. She reminded him of what she had done for him. She reminded him of the promises he had made. The letters did not survive, but their existence is documented. Charles received them. He did not respond. His silence was not passive. It was a sustained refusal to act while the trial moved toward its conclusion. The cost of ransoming her would have been smaller than the cost of many military campaigns Charles funded without hesitation. The diplomatic cost would have been real but not impossible. He had navigated more complex negotiations before. What he could not afford was the theological risk. If he defended Joan too strongly and the church declared her a heretic anyway, his own legitimacy would be compromised. If he stayed silent and allowed the trial to proceed, only Joan would burn. The calculation was brutal. It was also clear. She died believing he would intervene. The testimony from her final days suggests she held on to that expectation longer than the people around her did. They knew how trials like this ended. Joan did not. She had seen Charles crowned. She had seen armies rally to him. She had seen cities open their gates because she rode at the front. She believed the king she had made would not allow her to be destroyed by his enemies. She was wrong. What Charles gained from her abandonment was stability. The church had condemned her. That condemnation could have extended to him if he had challenged it openly. By allowing Joan to be sacrificed, he protected the coronation's legitimacy. He protected his fragile claim to the throne. He preserved his relationships with clergy who might have turned against him if he had defended a condemned heretic too aggressively. He survived. His kingdom survived. Joan did not. The rehabilitation in 1456 was not an act of conscience. It was an act of consolidation. Charles was secure by then. The English were defeated. The political landscape had stabilized enough that revisiting Joan's trial carried no real risk. Declaring her innocent allowed Charles to reclaim her symbolically without having defended her materially. She could be remembered as a martyr for France without anyone examining too closely why France had not saved her when it mattered. What no official record could erase was the sustained nature of the abandonment. She was not captured and killed suddenly. She was held for months. The trial lasted weeks. There were multiple points where intervention was possible. Each time, Charles chose silence. Each time, that silence moved her closer to the fire. The abandonment was not a failure of information or a miscalculation of timing. It was a deliberate withholding of protection from someone who had every reason to expect it. Joan of Arc saved a king who did not save her. That fact remains undisputed. What remains disputed is whether the silence that condemned her was a political necessity or a moral failure. The two are not mutually exclusive. Charles understood what his silence would cost her. He accepted that cost. History remembers her faith and her courage. It remembers less clearly the careful calculation that let her burn alone.